Hello, and thank you for joining me for an in-depth analysis of another classic and much discussed song. In this lesson, we will continue to hone our close reading chops by taking a good long look at Pink Floyd's Wish You Were Here. Much like Cohen's Hallelujah, the song's language is rich and poetic enough that we can just sort of jump in and probably end up walking away with some interesting perspectives on life's big questions. Fortunately, unlike Hallelujah, the language and imagery is basic enough that I won't have to spend lots of time explaining allusion after allusion. And though many of you will be quick to point out that Wish You Were Here can speak to some biographical details that were going on at the time of the song's writing, I think we would miss out on all that is universal in this song if we were to narrow our focus just to how these lyrics refer to one situation between one set of people at one particular point in time. So let's dig in. So you think you can tell heaven from hell, blue skies from pain? Can you tell a green field from a cold steel rail, a smile from a veil? Do you think you can tell? So the speaker starts off by posing several stacked rhetorical questions which also make use of juxtaposition, the first of which, heaven and hell, is about as common a juxtaposition as we can hope to find. Relying on connotation, we can understand that the speaker is framing his initial question and all the questions that follow around the idea of telling something good from something bad. This idea echoes throughout the whole first verse with our sense of connotation and the speaker's parallel syntax cluing us in as to which thing is good and which is bad. That is, the image with the positive connotation always comes first, and the image with the negative connotation always comes second. Heaven, blue skies, green field, and a smile are all by their very nature things to be embraced. And while hell and pain are intrinsically things to be rejected, a cold steel rail and a veil only take on a negative connotation when they are juxtaposed with a green field and a smile. The sense of industry and progress usually invoked by a cold steel rail, presumably that of a railroad, looks more like the cold steel of a prison bar when placed beside something so free, open, and pristine as a field. Similarly, when juxtaposed with the idea of a smile, the veil conceals the face that the smile reveals. In other words, it is through juxtaposition that the text infuses words with negative connotations they would not evoke by themselves. More subtle even than the speaker's use of juxtaposition is the tone with which the speaker conveys his questions. I would argue that because the word so, said twice no less, kicks off the entire first verse, the reader is free to read into the preceding questions anything from mild cynicism to an accusatory taunt to outright confrontation. Consider the difference between "where were you last night?" and "so, where were you last night?" The so, even without the inflection, can mean the difference between sounding curious and sounding accusatory. Of course, hearing these lines with a more adversarial tone based off one tiny, very open to interpretation word is far from inevitable. But we are still left with the fact that the speaker is asking if his listener can make distinctions that should be obvious. If some jumpy student driver runs a red light and the instructor asks, "Don't you know the difference between red and green?" the instructor is not asking if the student is colorblind. He is asserting that the student should know when to stop and when to go. Our hypothetical instructor's words certainly look like an earnest question on the surface, but our sense of verbal irony allows us to pierce through the literal and discern his intended meaning from his stated meaning. I believe that the same mechanism is at work in this part of the song, with the speaker's questions heavily suggesting, as rhetorical questions often do, that the speaker has already made up his mind as to what constitutes the difference between heaven and hell, and is simply waiting for his listener to draw the same conclusion. So instead of hearing, "Do you think you can tell the difference between heaven and hell?" in a kindergarten teacher's voice, it is possible to hear these questions as, "So, do you think you can tell heaven from hell?" In any case, the unwritten rules of verbal irony would lead us to believe that the relationship between speaker and listener isn't exactly
so happy together.
Things get a little more complicated, though, as we move into the second verse.
Did they get you to trade your heroes for ghosts, hot ashes for trees, hot air for a cool breeze, cold comfort for change? Did you exchange a walk-on part in the war for a lead role in a cage?
It is in the second verse that a third party enters into this one-sided exchange. The close reader will immediately ask, who are they? Who exactly got the listener to trade his, quote, heroes for ghosts? The text doesn't give us much to go on, but what we can assume is that this mysterious they has driven a wedge between the speaker and the listener, prompting the listener to trade heroes for ghosts. It is possible, given that the most ready-made connotation of psychedelic rock band is, well, psychedelics, that we can interpret they not as some group of shadowy individuals, but as the corrosive influence of drugs. While there doesn't seem to be anything in the text precluding such a reading, I can't locate anything that would oblige us to read it as a sort of intervention either. Drugs or no drugs, we still need to make sense of the whole heroes versus ghosts idea. It's not like the speaker keeps it nice and diametric with heroes for villains. Had he made this choice, the line would be no more difficult to decipher than heaven from hell. But we wouldn't learn anything more about the nature of the trade either. It seems that if we want the juice, we must, in the end, apply the pressure. We can start by asking what we come to understand about heroes and ghosts by juxtaposing one with the other, considering first how they are alike. It seems to me the most immediate similarity between a hero and a ghost is that they are both intangible abstractions of a person. In order for a human to be perceived as a hero, the perceiver amplifies the hero's virtues and muffles her vices, elevating, or from another angle reducing, a complex and flawed human being to the status of an icon off of which others might model themselves. A ghost, on the other hand, loses his humanity in a more bodily sense and becomes a kind of amorphous entity which elicits at worst apprehension and terror, and at best a kind of morbid curiosity. The ghost haunts where the hero inspires. To trade heroes for ghosts is therefore to trade the pursuit of an ideal for the pursuit of an ever-elusive phantom. As we look at the rest of the verse, we can see the syntax is now positioning as a trade what was in the first verse positioned as telling one thing from another. That is, the words, did they get you to trade, are implied as being before not only your heroes for ghosts, but hot ashes for trees, hot air for a cool breeze, and cold comfort for change as well. The speaker is essentially asking whether the listener has traded up, since growth and life are obviously preferable to decay and desolation, cool refreshment preferable to stifling heat, and motion preferable to stagnation. Yet the jury is still out on whether the listener actually has traded up, and if we assume that the verbal irony established in the first verse has continued into the second, and the text gives us no indication that it hasn't, we are prone to share the speaker's skepticism as to whether the mysterious they have actually delivered on their end of the bargain. It was a trade after all. We should be well aware at this point that the speaker is taking a dichotomous view of the world, but does not tell us directly what actions, behaviors, or circumstances have prompted this barrage of rhetorical questions. In other words, we are left without a fictional context or narrative to help us picture the players in this drama. Two related questions emerge. Does the text provide us with some way of understanding the conflict between the speaker and his listener? Must we, the audience, be content with a series of vague metaphorical suggestions, or can those metaphors give us a window into the nature of the problem? I believe they can, albeit with a little bit of work. Let's first consider everything that the speaker has positioned as being good or preferable, and see if we can establish an overarching relationship between the imagery. So far, on the good side, we have heaven, blue skies, green field, a smile, heroes, trees, a cool breeze, and change. On the bad side, we have hell, pain, cold still rail, a veil, ghosts, hot ashes, hot air, and cold comfort. If we consider these images more symbolically, we can see a dichotomy start to form with freedom, growth, and striving on the light side, and with confinement, complacency, and decay on the dark. The lines that follow not only offer a bit more context, they are also, if I do say so myself, some of the most profound words ever put to music.
Did you exchange a walk-on part in the war for a lead role in a cage?
Drawing on the conceptual metaphor of life as a stage, the speaker yet again juxtaposes an image of freedom with an image of confinement, but adds a few dimensions to the dynamic. First, let's look at what we come to discover about wars and cages when we juxtapose the two. Neither of the words have entirely positive or negative connotations. Wars offer a nice open space in which to fight, a green field, if you will, but in the same way that wars promise glory to the victors and honor to the sacrificed, they are also fraught with danger. A cage offers just the opposite, a chokingly claustrophobic, albeit low risk and highly controlled environment. So the speaker is asking if the listener exchange the opportunity to be just another brick in the wall in a no guts, no glory environment, or to occupy the spotlight in a prison. But the speaker is much more ambiguous here about which the listener, and by extension we, the audience, should prefer. Both, after all, have inherent advantages and disadvantages. But because the speaker's metaphors have placed such a positive spin on the ideas of freedom, freshness, and striving, we can assume that the war is preferable to the cage. If the speaker had wanted to privilege security over freedom, he would have picked very different metaphors up until this point. If demonization of freedom rather than valorization was his goal, he would have spoken not in terms of a blue sky, but the sobering pull of gravity, not of a green field, but of a savage wilderness, and not of a smile, but of the protective warmth of anonymity. In short, he would have emphasized freedom's perils over its perks. Looking at the larger implications on representation in general, when we sit down to design a text, we are free to construe ideas however we will. And the metaphors we choose will be one of many text features that reflect how we see the world. The metaphors keep coming in the final verse, but so does a bit of clarity.
How I wish you were here, with just two lost souls swimming in a fishbowl, year after year, running over the same old ground. What have we found? The same old fears. Wish you were here.
The last interpretive piece of the puzzle falls into place with this verse or chorus or whatever you want to call it. With the end of the speaker's seeming interrogation, his tone shifts from skeptical to sincere, the false start at the beginning making it seem like he's struggling to find the words. He moves from challenging his listener to simply missing him. But in keeping with the whole freedom versus security dynamic, we have to wonder whether the speaker wants the listener to join him as he skips merrily through the minefield, or crowd with him into the cubicles of anonymity. Does he want a fellow warrior or a cribmate? Based off what we've seen so far in the song, it is fair to assert that the speaker's love of freedom has alienated him from a listener who sought security. But if we insist that the speaker's tone is ironic up until this point, that he actually means the opposite of what he is saying, we can easily speculate on the reverse as well. This interpretation can find additional support in the fact that every trade after the word ghosts is for the thing more associated with freedom. Regardless of who's who, the speaker goes on to compare himself and his listener to two lost souls swimming in a fishbowl, meaning that despite one or the other's ambition, they are both in some way, shape, or form left to paddle around aimlessly in stagnation's tepid waters. Running over the same old ground implies a lot of movement with no progress, with life's journey of discovery yielding nothing nothing more than the same old fears. The physical change of scenery has not allowed either of them to escape the psychological fishbowl. But before we allow ourselves to drown in this cosmic aquarium, reducing all of life to running on a proverbial hamster wheel, we must take into account the speaker's final wistful wish you were here. This would suggest that despite the speaker's all the world's a cage mentality, he still finds value in the relationship he had with the listener, even if that relationship exists solely through the mists of nostalgia. Keeping in mind that absence is more than a physical phenomenon, the speaker could very well be calling out to someone who is merely psychologically absent. Regardless of whether the listener is absent physically, mentally, or just plain dead, the song offers us a fine example of apostrophe. But why should we engage with someone or something that is in no position to reply? As with most art, there seems to be two primary motivations. One, to achieve the sense of catharsis that so often comes along with long monologues, and two, to salvage a lesson when the tides of life cough up the wreckage of what we once had. So what is the lesson? For all its rhetorical questions and layers of flaky and delicious metaphors, the song's ultimate philosophical resting place, for me, is in those final four words, wish you were here. What seems at first to offer a meditation on the all-important questions of freedom and security, considerations that have not only political but very personal ramifications, the speaker seems to settle on the notion that all that really matters is the relationship. For him, the company will forever eclipse the venue. You'll notice that I haven't read any biographical details into the song, not because such an approach is invalid, but because it tends to limit the scope and power of the song. I've always thought it could fit with equal snugness into the mouth of, say, a musician who's lost his fellow bandmate to the corporate world, or a jilted homegrown lover abandoned by a soulmate on a journey to, quote, find themselves. In any case, we are free to let our life experiences furnish particulars that will make the song resonate on a more personal level. And this is probably one reason why the song and the band have been met with so much success despite their usually brainy subject matter. That is all I have to say, but certainly not all that can be said. What have I oversimplified, overcomplicated, or left out altogether? Be sure to let me know in the comments below, and please be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth song analysis. This is Professor Chase. Hope to see you next lesson.